Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is November the 5th, 2018, and this is podcast number 22. A couple of housekeeping items I have to get out of the way before we move into this podcast. I am sorry to say that I have decided to stop making the French and Spanish versions for these podcasts. It is too much. I don't have the time to dedicate to producing those 3 podcasts every week. In the future, I may reconsider doing that again, but for now, I have decided to stop it. The second thing I want to talk about is last week I was not able to record this podcast because I had some personal problems. Somebody apparently tampered with my car. As I was leaving my driveway, all of a sudden I had absolutely no control over the vehicle. It was a jolt because there was no brakes. For a while, we thought it was the end. Because where I live, there are cars passing in front of the house at full speed. Almost every 5 seconds, there's a car passing in front of the house. The scariest part of it all is after this ordeal, I called the police, and I was very surprised to find out that the police only serve and protect certain people and under certain circumstances. I spoke with a very rude and condescending gentleman, and he told me flat out that this is not a police matter, that he would not come to investigate what happened. So it was hard. We couldn't believe it because I had never heard the police wouldn't show up to help somebody in need. But that's where we found ourselves, and this is my reality. Again, I don't want to burden you with my problems, but sometimes it is important because if my mind is not in the right place, I cannot record these podcasts. And that's what happened last week. It was a terrible ordeal. It was hard to deal with, and I was upset because I had never heard the police would flat out say to a citizen that we're not going to serve you. And that's what happened. But again, this is my reality. Anyway, let's get into the podcast for today. Today we're going to talk about ethics. One of the key questions people always ask is what is ethics? When you say ethics, what does that mean? What does the term ethics mean? Today we're going to talk about this concept because when people do things or when people don't do things, they usually justify their behavior or their actions on a certain set of rules or principles that either they grew up believing in those principles or these are principles that along the way they created for themselves. So everybody has a certain set of ethical rules that guide that individual's behavior. So the question is, when people do things or when people decide to do things, is it always the right thing? Because somebody could justify doing something by saying this is the right thing, but it is always the right thing for everybody. Is my right thing the same as your right thing? Okay. And this is what we're going to be discussing in this series. We're going to be talking about the concept of ethics, the types of ethics. We're going to delve into that in depth. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. What is ethics? The term ethics is a very fluid terminology. It is an elastic terminology, so to speak. Generally, when we are talking about ethics, we are talking about the concept of morality. We're talking about the concept of righteousness or a moral virtue. So what that means is that there is a universal way of being in the world. That universal way of being could be understood as righteousness. there are certain ways to be. There are certain ways to go about being. There are certain ways to conduct oneself in the world. And that way is defined as righteousness. In other words, you are supposed to be the right way. You are supposed to act the right way. You are supposed to do the right thing. So the question you might be asking is whether there is a difference between ethics and ontology. I would say no. The concept of ethics by itself, it is based on the notion of moral virtue. And if we're talking about a moral virtue, we're talking about a philosophical principle, a philosophical tenet as to what things are supposed to be. So ethics could be understood as a moral duty, a moral obligation to be a certain way, to do things a certain way, and to behave in the world a certain way. Of course, the underlying understanding here is that the individual is free to be. So the notion implies a certain level of freedom on the part of the individual. So in other words, the individual gets to choose, the individual gets to be, gets to decide whether to be a certain way. But the way the individual is supposed to be is the righteous way. The individual is expected to adapt, to adhere to the righteous or the moral virtue, which is in and of itself universal. Of course, we've talked about this in other recordings. This is not necessarily the case. We talked about this in terms of the notion of law, how the law does not apply universally. So the concept of morality is a fluid concept because it does not apply universally. Nonetheless, the concept of ethics is based on the notion that the individual gets to be a certain way. The individual gets to decide whether to be and not to be a certain way. So the individual who is inherently moral or inherently righteous would always do the right thing, would always be the right way. So when we're talking about ethics, we have to consider three foundational elements. We're talking about metaethics, applied ethics. We are also talking about normative ethics. Whenever we're talking about metaethics, we're talking about the foundations of morality. We're talking about the nature of moral discourse. We are talking about moral facts. We're talking about moral language, the concept of moral judgments. Applied ethics is concerned with the practical aspect of ethics. So basically, it is what do you do in certain situations? How do you behave in certain situations? Now, this approach to ethics is mostly apparent when we're talking about politics, when we're talking about economics, societal issues, administrations, organizations. In the example I gave before about the incident in front of my house, when the police officer told me that he would not come to assist the family when we needed help, he made an ethical decision because from his perspective, he did the right thing. Okay. Now, from my perspective, he did not do the right thing because I needed help. Yet he decided not to afford that help. But this is an example to show you that applied ethics is the application, so to speak, of certain ethical decisions. One could argue that the police officer had an obligation to come to assist. One could argue that he also had an obligation not to do it if my situation didn't fall within a certain ethical paradigm which is established within the organization he represents at the time, which is the police in my community. So the concept of ethics within the confine of applied ethics could be understood as the way certain decisions are applied or are made, certain actions are taken or omitted. So this is the best way to understand applied ethics. Now, normative ethics is best understood within the confine of certain established norms or principles. Okay, as I said in the beginning, there are certain behaviors, there are certain conducts that could be seen as inherently wrong, But the same conduct could be seen as inherently right. But the difference between whether the conduct is right or wrong could be understood based on the norms that are in effect in a particular societal environment. So if the norms dictate the behavior, so within that context, that behavior could be considered ethical. So when we're talking about applied ethics, we're talking about the application of certain moral virtue. So in other words, normative ethics emphasize the nature of morality or moral principles. So usually when we're talking about normative ethics, we're talking about principles that are designed to serve the greater good, society as a whole. In the example mentioned before, it may not be my right, but if it is right for the collective, then it becomes okay, it becomes normal to behave or to conduct oneself in a certain way. So when we're talking about normative ethics, we're talking about principles or virtues which are designed to serve the community as a whole. Of course, this does not necessarily mean that those virtues are righteous, but they could be defined as such or within the confine of this particular environment. Okay. Next week, we're going to delve a little deeper into this concept to understand ethics a little better. So see you next week.